Camping is one of Dead by Daylight's oldest and most controversial strategies, dear viewer. For as long as this game has existed, killers have been able to exploit a survivor's vulnerability as they attempt to rescue a teammate. For their part, behaviour have attempted to discourage and punish the use of this strategy over the years, but to little effect. Today, I want to explore a rework concept that seeks to massively reduce the efficacy of camping, whilst empowering killers that focus on more interesting gameplay. Let's start by defining the idea of camping. Now, at first viewer, this may seem a little redundant, but it's important that we're all on the same page. Outlining what I consider to be camping will give you a better idea of the problems I seek to solve with this rework concept. For the most part, we all understand the broad concept of what camping is: killers patrolling near hooked survivors. However, the difficulty comes with certain outlying behaviours. What some people consider camping, others may euphemistically refer to as defending the hook. So, what is camping? For the purposes of this video, camping is either the act of remaining within proximity of a hooked survivor in order to earn health states on rescuers with little to no resistance, or returning to a recently unhooked survivor in order to take health states with little to no resistance. This simple outline should give you, dear viewer, an idea as to the sort of behaviour I'm attempting to punish with this rework concept. So, now let's talk about why these behaviours are problematic. First, it actively punishes survivors for engaging with healthy and necessary gameplay. Survivors need to unhook their teammates, otherwise their chances of survival are dramatically lowered as their teammates are eliminated. However, when a killer camps, any saviour will lose a health or possibly even hook state. They're actively being punished for playing the game as it was intended. Next, camping takes no skill. It is, in fact, the opposite of skill expression. Instead of earning health states by outplaying their opponents, killers can simply force a survivor into a lose-lose situation which they have no control over. There's no need to use a chase power, perks or mind games when you can simply take health states from survivors who can't put up any resistance. The closest equivalent I can think of to compare this to is the act of W keying. Rather than engaging in a chase, survivors can sometimes simply run around an object with no need to use obstacles, perks or mind games. Instead, they can mindlessly buy time through the simple act of moving forward. Camping is much the same, in the opposite direction. The act of a killer not moving can grant them health states without the need to play around obstacles, perks or mind games. Which leads me to my final point. It's boring. The most exciting part of this game, dear viewer, is chases. Camping is the opposite of chasing. It's a foregone conclusion. There's no room for variation because there's no chasing. Instead, a killer simply patrols near a hook and a survivor loses a health or hook state depending on the killer's attack cooldown. But Cameron, I hear you cry, behaviour have made several attempts to counter this with various perks and even a self-unhook system. This is very true, dear viewer, but the utility of these counters is limited. Using perks to counter this behaviour is, in my opinion, poor design. If you want a full breakdown of why, click the button in the top right, or use the link in the description. But, in short, despite there being several perks that can counter camping, it still remains a prevalent issue. Okay Cameron, but behaviour did also create a base kit solution, the self-unhook system. Well, dear viewer, behaviour did create that system, but I wouldn't call it a solution. Camping remains a prevalent issue within Dead by Daylight, and this system never does anything about it. In fact, dear viewer, I've only ever seen this system activate twice in all my time spent playing DBD. And one of those times was because a Dredge player went AFK after hooking me. Apparently there was a wasp in their room, which caused them to freak out and go AFK, which, let's be honest, is perfectly reasonable. The problem is that this system is far too safe. Any teammate proximity will cause this system to be entirely redundant, but that means your team needs to leave you on the hook. But if the killer leaves, they need to quickly unhook you before the killer returns, which they can't do if they have to be a huge distance from you. So, if your teammates try to help you, which they should do, this system fails. Also, even if a killer camps the general area, they can usually avoid granting you a free self-unhook, since this system requires very close proximity to gain any decent charge. This is especially relevant when killers are at a different elevation to the hooked survivor. In these cases, a killer will contribute far fewer charges, which, depending on the map, can allow killers to efficiently camp without fear of charging the self-unhook bar. Also, this system does nothing to stop killers from quickly returning to a recent unhook in order to gain the same free hit that they would have gotten by simply camping at a closer range. I could go on and on, dear viewer, but I think you get the point. In order to keep the system safe, behaviour, understandably, attached so many clauses that the system realistically does little to counter camping, and instead only prevents face camping. That's it. So, what are we going to do about all of this? Well, dear viewer, this concept starts with a few changes that greatly reduce the pressure a killer can exert by remaining close to hooked survivors. First, a simple but potent effect. Anytime a killer is within 32 meters of a hooked survivor, regardless of elevation, that survivor's sacrifice timer would count down 3 times slower than usual. This would take the usual 70-second timer up to 210 seconds, or 3.5 minutes, before entering the next hook state. This would be more than enough time to make serious progress on the objective, and would cripple a killer's ability to pressure survivors by camping. The massively extended timer would mean that survivors don't feel the pressure to rescue their teammates while a killer is nearby. Instead, they would be free to complete healing, repairs, or cleansing for several minutes before needing to rescue their teammate. Okay Cameron, but what about returning to the hook? Couldn't a killer sit outside the 32 meter range and just wait for a noise notification? Yes, dear viewer, they certainly could, which leads me to the next set of changes. First, this concept removes the killer's ability to see the sacrifice timer. This would prevent them from making informed decisions about camping and reduce the reliability of this strategy. Further, a killer would no longer receive noise notifications anytime a survivor is unhooked. This information only encourages a killer to return to the hook, which is something that this concept is attempting to discourage. In tandem with this would be a new symbol associated with hooked survivors. Rather than seeing them as hooked, a killer would only see a shrouded symbol, which would persist for 30 seconds after a survivor is unhooked, or until they perform a conspicuous action, whichever comes first. Finally, is a haste bonus granted to anyone that rescues a teammate from the hook. If a survivor hasn't been in a chase for at least 10 seconds, they would gain a 7% haste bonus for 10 seconds after rescuing a teammate. This would allow any rescuing survivors to move to a nearby loop if a killer does attempt to return to a recently unhooked survivor. In total, these changes would mean that a killer has much less information on the status of hooked survivors. This in turn would make returning to the hook for easy hits a much less consistent strategy. Killers could return at any point and see that either the survivor is long gone or still hooked, with no ability to know until they visibly see the hook. The goal is to make returning to the hook a frustrating and inconsistent affair, with killers being unable to know if returning to a hooked survivor would be a worthwhile endeavour. Instead, the more consistent strategy would be to chase survivors and focus on outplaying them in loops in order to gain more hook states as the trial progresses. Well Cameron, I hear you say that's a lot of sticks and no carrots, but in the intro you said you want to empower killers that focus on fun gameplay. I certainly did, dear viewer, and that's where the entity's hunger comes in. After chasing a survivor for 10 continuous seconds, a killer would gain 200 sacrifice points for the entity's avidity event. At this point, the entity wants to dispatch any currently hooked survivors in order to prepare for the upcoming hook. As a result, for as long as this chase continues, hook timers wouldn't be slowed by a killer's proximity. Instead, all sacrifice timers would be accelerated by 33%, taking the default 70-second timer down to 47 seconds. This effect would persist for 5 seconds after a chase ends, with an ability to chain chases together in that window. Further, hooking a survivor would cause all currently hooked survivors to lose 10 seconds on their sacrifice timer. In total, this system would greatly increase the pressure that killers could exert through chases. Now, the accelerated sacrifice timers would require survivors to prioritise rescuing their teammates over other actions such as repairs or cleansing. Survivors couldn't finish off their current task without the risk of their teammates entering the next hook state. As such, if a killer focuses on chasing survivors, unhooking would become the priority and slow the survivors' progress in a match. The goal of this system is to make chasing the most effective way to pressure survivors in a trial. Finally, as you may have guessed, the sacrifice timer extension would be disabled once the exit gates are powered. However, if a killer chose to chase survivors during the endgame, the entity's hunger would still activate. At the end of all that, you may be thinking, great Cameron, but this system would make hooking survivors in the basement pointless. And you'd be correct, dear viewer. Currently, the basement acts as nothing more than a danger zone. Survivors that are hooked in the basement are notoriously difficult to save. Killers can simply camp the area and use traps, lethal abilities and reduced attack cooldowns to earn easy health or even hook states. But, under this concept, dragging a survivor all the way to the basement would be pointless, since it'd be difficult for a killer to capitalise on the unhooking action in any way. And that's why this concept includes a number of changes to the way the basement works for the purposes of the entity's hunger. First, all of the basement would be considered 0 meters from the hook for the purposes of affecting sacrifice timers. Instead, the distance would be centered from the top of the stairs. Being within 32 meters of this point would cause the sacrifice timer to be slowed. Next, all the basement hooks would be Scourge hooks. This effect is currently granted by the perk Monstrous Shrine. Under this concept, however, the effect would be base kit. Finally, hooking a survivor in the basement would grant a killer several Reverent Bonuses. Pleased that a survivor has been hooked in the entity's favoured area, the killer would be granted 3 separate bonuses from the entity. First, the haste bonus would grant the killer a 7% haste bonus for 20 seconds after leaving the basement. The action bonus would grant the killer a 25% increased vault or break speed for the next 2 actions they perform. And finally, the regression favour would grant the killer a 50% quicker damage speed and an increased 5% immediate regression on the first generator they damage. The goal here is to provide a use for the basement, outside of simply camping it. With these changes, hooking a survivor in the basement would still be a worthwhile endeavour. And, as a survivor, seeing a teammate hooked in the basement would still be an impactful moment, but for a very different reason. Rather than rolling your eyes and thinking about how the killer is about to get a bunch of free hits, you'll instead be thinking about how the killer will be more effective at hindering repairs and chasing you and your allies. The goal is to create a satisfying system that empowers killers, but in a way that is much healthier and more interesting. Damn Cameron, I hear you say, that's quite the rework, but I can already see this system making several perks redundant. So can I, dear viewer, and that's where this section comes in, to provide a series of perk reworks based on the changes made in this concept. We'll start with the perk Camaraderie. This perk acts as an anti-camping perk, but in a very weak sense. So this concept massively buffs the perk to apply to both yourself and others, for much longer, and when within a much larger range. Basically, this is the only anti-camping perk you'll ever need, with value outside of camping situations. Looping the killer near a hooked teammate? This perk will help. Need to interrupt regression before saving a hooked survivor? This perk will help. Need to cleanse or bless a totem before rescuing an ally? This perk will help. Next is Reassurance, which, with the previous perk rework, has been made extra redundant. So this rework turns it into a unique healing perk. Rather than increasing healing speed, it grants immediate healing progress to nearby allies based on a token system. The focus is still on altruism, since it's a Rebecca Chambers teachable perk, but now it improves your ability to heal teammates. Now, for killer perks we'll start with Monstrous Shrine. Obviously, under this concept, multiple aspects of the perk have been made base kit in some form. So this reworked version allows killers to gain the Reverent Bonuses for putting a survivor on any Scourge hook, not just on basement hooks. Further, it slightly increases the bonuses provided by the favours to improve a killer's ability to exert pressure. This perk would improve a killer's mobility, slowdown, and chase potential, all in a single perk. A jack of all trades, if you will. Next is Make Your Choice. Whilst this perk isn't too oppressive, it does focus on returning to the hook, something that this rework concept heavily discourages. So, this reworked version instead gives unhooked survivors a difficult choice. If they heal within 30 seconds of being unhooked, they'll suffer from reduced repair speeds. If, however, they don't heal, they'll instead suffer from the broken status effect for a prolonged period. The choice here is simple, but also difficult. Should a survivor be cautious at the cost of repair speeds, or should they make the risky choice to avoid reducing repair speeds and remain injured for a prolonged period? Finally is Territorial Imperative. Not only is this perk terrible, but it also makes for some unhealthy gameplay. The most consistent way to gain value from this perk is to hook someone in the basement and then use this perk as a radar to tell you when a teammate is trying to rescue them. Then you can return to the basement and gain all of the free hits with no repercussions. Again, something we want to discourage. So, this concept completely reworks the effect of the perk. After hooking a survivor, all generators, chests and totems within 24 meters of the hooked survivor would be blocked by the entity until that survivor is unhooked. This effect would then persist for 30 seconds after the survivor is unhooked. In total, this perk would prevent players from prioritizing cleansing or repairing before or immediately after an unhooking action. That's it for this one. These are all the suggestions I have for improving the anti-camping system's current weaknesses as I see them. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment down below. Whatever your ideas are, I want to hear them. I don't make this video to declare my ideas as gospel or something, I just hope to maybe inspire some conversations, especially with this sort of concept. It can be difficult to create a system that isn't abusable or exploitable while still countering certain strategies. I'm sure there are factors I haven't considered or scenarios that could undermine this system. Please let me know what you think about all of this. By discussing our ideas and putting them together, we can get that bit closer to making DBD the best version of itself. Thank you very much for watching, dear viewer, and I hope to see you in the next one.